Welcome to 2024. I am Bret. This is my show. We're back, baby. I was here last week, but I'm still back for another year. We've got so much planned for this year. I don't want to spoil all the surprises, but if you're getting the newsletter, every week I'm announcing who's going to be on the show, and we now have a fancy little calendar. We're in the 2000s now. We have a calendar feed. So if you get on the newsletter, and let's just check that out. Over here, Bret.news, you can check out the DevOps newsletter. It's once a week. And this week, I have a list. We're going to talk about this list. But first, this is also a podcast. So if anything interesting happens on the show, and only if, because I don't put every episode into the podcast, but we have a podcast. It's podcast.bretfisher.com, or just go to bretfisher.com, like that little link above over there says. Just go up there, and you can jump into the podcast, listen to the interesting bits in audio, edited by my fine friend and wonderful editor, Christy. He's been with us for years now, and manages to take all my ums and uhs and all that stuff out, so you can enjoy the sweet perfection of just the interesting bits in audio. And that's over here, or you're any podcast player. Let me know if you're actually someone who listens to the podcast and watches this show. If anyone in chat says, yeah, I've actually listened to the podcast before, because I tend to get one or the other. Like, people come up to me at conferences and say, hey, I listened to your podcast. I love your podcast. And they don't ever, I don't know if they mean the show or the actual podcast, because people just say words. It's just words, videos, sounds, audios, like it's just words. And then we have, what else we got? So we got that podcast, we got the newsletter, we have the Discord server. You see that link right above me. We're all hanging out in here, and you can find out events. So we have an event list, and it's like a little calendar in Discord. So you can see who's going to be on the show as well as any other events in the Discord server. Did you know we have a bi-monthly Swarm meetup, in case you're a Swarm fan? Did you know, let's see what else we do there. We have a monthly high fivers. So if you're willing to buy me a coffee, it's just sort of a quality barrier. Just don't think of it as it costs money to get in. Think of it as, I'm just going to give Bret $5 for a cup of coffee, and that way only the serious people are going to show up to the high fivers. We have that every month. And that's just DevOps people hanging out, talking about what they're working on, projects they're working on, questions they have, what they're learning. It's a great talk. It's not that many people. It's almost always less than 10 people. So it's a nice small group. We get to focus in. And if you have questions, or maybe you're taking my courses and you have some questions about that you want to just discuss with a group, the high fivers is the way to go. We do that, I think it's on Wednesdays, and that'll be up here, which we don't have any yet for this year, because we're like everyone else, just trying to figure out what 2024 is going to be. So we're going to get all that fed in there, and you will hear about it here on the live show. Okay. All right. Hello, Eric Martin. What's up? Piam, Caesar's here from Bolivia. You're serious. I mean, half the time in high fivers, what is it with this text? Why is this text box like way too high up there? There we go. I don't need the text box in front of my face. All right. Yes, Eric, we are very serious. So serious that sometimes we go that whole DevOps conversation with the high fivers, and we only talk about our hobbies. Speaking of hobbies, I have a keyboard over here. Actually, technically a MIDI controller. I'm going back into the 1990s when I first played with MIDI. That's how old that technology is. And I'm relearning piano and keyboarding. So not this kind of keyboard, that kind of keyboard. So that was one of my Christmas gifts. And hopefully you all had, if you celebrate Christmas, you had a great Christmas, and maybe you got a couple things you wanted that you didn't buy for yourself. All right. Michael's back. The boss DevOps gang. Nice. All right. What else? So I have this list. It's a list. And it was sort of like a list of maybe, I mean, it's not 10 things, but sort of my top 10 things that I definitely want to explore this year. And I'm sure that that list will be replaced by another list within the next few months. So the goal here was to get people thinking on the newsletter. So this was sent out yesterday. So if you didn't get the newsletter, Bret.news. Get the newsletter, and I'm basically looking for replies to that email. Instead of some fancy form or survey, just reply. Just hit reply, copy the ones you care about. And I've only got a few replies so far, so people need to read this and reply to this. So what do you want to hear from? What guest do you want on the show? Now this is a very small list. This is honestly the kind of list that probably should just be like the first month or two of the year. And, what's new in Kubernetes? One of the things I started thinking of doing was shorts, YouTube shorts, that I rapidly went through all the major things that I cared about in each Kubernetes release. And, we're not quite to 130 yet, but 129's out. And there's lots of videos on all the new features, but are they as short? Are they 60 seconds? So I might try that. Docker Cloud build, you just heard last week, if you were on the show with me last week, with Michael Irwin on, we've heard that Docker Cloud build will be out this month, released from beta or tech preview or early release or whatever they're calling things, early access. And then Argo CD is continuing to grow up, continuing to get more and more of the edge cases covered and little things. And Argo CD Easy Path is something that I've worked on for a few years, but I think it could be even easier, especially if you're on GitHub. You can use fancy things like the GitHub API application set extension with Argo CD to essentially have it look for a file, a very specific file, in every repo that you give it inside of search parameters, but every repo on GitHub, and it'll automatically bring in those apps, which means you can go in theory, there's a certain limit, because some people are complaining that if they have hundreds of repos that the API limits are problematic, but that you could basically have, let's say, dozens, maybe 100 repos, and every time you add a new app that you want to deploy to Kubernetes, you just create a particular set of files in that repo, and you have to do nothing else. You don't have another PR somewhere else. You don't have like an infrastructure repo PR. You could do that. That's been out for a couple of years now, but I don't really talk about that much in my GitOps course, which, if you didn't know about that I didn't mention, is over here. I got to spell it right. But yeah, over on this course. So be one of the first to sign up there if you're interested. Just go to this link. I'll put it in the chat. And we're not really sure when we're going to set the next date. And we might have later this quarter, maybe next quarter, we might have some announcements about different ways that you can consume this course. So the way to find out about that content is to just sign up there. You're not going to get that many emails about it, but it will help me know who to reach out to when we change something or we set dates, whatever. We did this twice last year and it was a hit. I really enjoyed working with the different teams. It was a live course, so you got to learn and then come into class. We all did class in Zoom. So, I like Argo. I like GitOps specifically. Like, Argo is a great tool, but GitOps is what I'm after. And it's really, to me, just the eventual extension of infrastructure as code. It's like the next thing you can do after you have infrastructure as code is standardize how you deploy that infrastructure as code into Kubernetes. And now that's starting to happen in other things besides Kubernetes. We've seen people dabble with what they're calling GitOps in other infrastructure and clouds, maybe even a swarm tool here and there. And I could debate on whether that's true GitOps, because I think people get confused between the difference of infrastructure as code plus automation and then true GitOps. And GitOps has remediation, it has drift detection, it has all these things built in that you may not just get by automating your deployments. And that's not GitOps. That is just automation and infrastructure as code. And if you remember, if we go to open GitOps, is it open GitOps.dev? Got to type Git right. So open GitOps will tell you what the people that sort of started this movement and the people that are in the middle of trying to establish what does GitOps mean and what is not GitOps, because that's one of the challenges we have with other terms in the industry, like MLOps or DevOps or DevSecOps. What does that include and what does that not include? It can't possibly be everything, and we need to be able to know it when we see it. And I love that the GitOps principles are 4 very specific requirements, but pulled automatically and continuously reconciled are 2 that often, and vendors, this is part of your problem, vendors who want to catch the wave of some trendy new term like GitOps will just hand wave over the fact that they don't do all 4 of these things. And they'll say, yeah, but we're GitOps. But no, they're really just declarative, maybe a little versioned and immutable, and maybe automated, but probably not pulled automatically from the infrastructure itself, and certainly most likely not continuously reconciled and fixed. Terraform, I'm looking at you. GitLab, I'm looking at you. I've seen so many companies throwing this term around that, yeah, they don't really do all this stuff, but then they just decide that they're going to come up with their own definition. But they're not the ones that came up with GitOps, the term. They're not the ones that started the practices like Weaveworks. So I don't feel like they get to control the name or the definition for what they mean it to be. I feel like something like this industry standard website where multiple companies came together, they have conferences that, it's a part of the GitOps working group, part of the CNCF. Like this is standards. And I feel like this is the way you should be behaving, not just making up your own definition. Anyway, that's a soapbox moment. That wasn't even my point. But let's go back to the list. All right, so on this list, yay, GitHub Copilot. I talked about GitHub Copilot like 2.5 years ago. We haven't done a lot with it, but the CoPilot Chat makes it basically like ChatGPT inside of VS Code now. So we should take another look, I feel like. I've mentioned it a couple of times. I wrote about it in one of my newsletters last year about my experience with using CoPilot to write a brand new app from scratch in a language that I was not used to writing from scratch, which happened to be Go. Go is something that I've been reading for a decade and maybe pull requesting a little bit here and there, but never really writing a real useful tool of my own from scratch other than like learning through courses or stuff like that. Maybe some simple tool. Well, I wanted something real that I would use, and I wanted to write it in Go, and it was specifically because I wanted a CLI tool. And so I wanted a single binary, and I wanted to be able to package it up in Docker images, but also just download the binary and run it locally. So I chose Go for that, and I didn't want to have to reference any course materials. I was also out of date on Go. I was many versions, probably 4 or 5 versions at least, out of date of the practices of modern Go. For example, I learned a little bit about Go and how to start using it, writing code in it, back before we even had the standard module support we have now. You sort of had to get other add-ons to handle your modules management. And that's not true anymore. So that's all changed. I had to sort of refigure out how all this stuff works together in the ecosystem. Anyway, the long story there is I had a whole newsletter about my experience last summer. In 4 hours, I was able to write an app using modern practices, and essentially it was using ChatGPT. But it was in VS Code using Copilot. Now, it was a labs tool. Now it's a release tool of CoPilot Chat. And that changed the game for me because it taught me that I can actually learn without at least learning some of the things without being in a course. I can actually do something productive writing in a tool that I know a little bit, right? It wasn't like day one for me. I can certainly read Go. So yeah, that was a really great experience, but I'd love to do more of that. I'd like to actually bring people on and we do some stuff live and just talk about different languages, specifically for DevOps, maybe not for programming languages too heavily, because we're all developers on some spectrum. Maybe just some of you are just shell scripters, which is totally fine. I'm not a professional developer. I don't get paid for my source code skills. So I would be interested in experimenting more with this, using more DevOps tools inside of Copilot and seeing how that makes it easier. Maybe I can learn, and I don't know this, but maybe we can try things like adding Terraform providers or other extensions to various tooling, and without having to go research on the internet, which is the best one, which is the one I'm supposed to use, which is the most popular one. I'm wondering if I can just live in CoPilot Chat, having it answer all my questions without having to constantly Google around to find the tools I need. That's a really interesting thing I want to try out. Gen AI for Docker is something that I have only dabbled in, and it was also announced at KubeCon, DockerCon. They both have examples of using Olama, who we're going to have on the show this year. So if you're interested in more about how you would set up your own LLM, or basically your own local chat GPT experience, you can do that with an open toolkit of stuff. I mean, if you're someone who's already down the rabbit hole of Hugging Face and all of the LLM stuff out there, then good for you. I am not that advanced yet. So I want to definitely check out what Docker's done, a little bit of what they did from KubeCon, because there was an example they used. Of course, Docker Scout was announced last year and was released in the fall. There's a lot more to it, especially with the integrations. So last week on the show, we talked about the Docker Scout security model and how they're just trying to plug themselves into all these different parts of your workflow. And I'd like to explore the extensions for that. I'd like to see how Docker Scout scans other image repositories besides Docker Hub, and how I can use it more in GitHub Actions. I'd honestly like to just make my Docker Scout automatically scan in all of my actions, in all my repos, across all my courses. We're talking like maybe a dozen repos. It's not that much. It sounds like I have a lot, but I don't. Like a dozen repos. And I make images, and I'd like those images to all be taken care of by Docker Scout. And I'd also love for each PR I do, which is one of the things Scout can do, is it will compare how many CVEs I'm adding or removing based on the main branch or the branch I'm merging into and the branch that I'm actually pull requesting, that I'm editing. So am I making my images better or worse? And that's a really cool thing Scout can do. So there's a lot of stuff on here. So anyway, I'm going to send this out to you. Go take a look at that link and let me know either in chat or just, sign up for the newsletter and reply to the newsletter, however you want to get it to me. And give me these or other ideas in the cloud native DevOps space, because that's where I kind of spend my time. And what other ideas for topics there? I mean, there's tons of stuff. We're going to have Harbor on the show this year to talk about what I think is the most feature-rich open source image registry out there. And we're going to find out about new things that are working on. We're currently setting up the date for that now, so we will let you know. So let's get into chat. Dan, what's up? I got kubectx installed on my box from Bret's suggestion. I like all the tools that learned from Discord community. Yeah, that's a great plug for the Discord. Thank you. So yeah, if you didn't know, I'm going to make this a little smaller so you can bring that down there. In case you didn't know, we have a DevOps server right there on Discord. You can join that. I think we're about to hit 17,000 people, and it's a steady stream of knowledge. I mean, honestly, I can't keep up with it. I can't keep up with all the chatter. Toby's a big GitHub Actions fan. Awesome. Yes, it is my go-to. We did have Dagger on the show last year. So you notice one of my options here, Dagger IO examples for how to use it with GitHub Actions and also be able to run your stuff locally. Now with GitHub Actions, you can use ACT, ACT, which is a third-party tool for running GitHub Actions locally, but it's not great. One of the challenges with it is the secrets providers. So you end up essentially, I feel like, in the way that I understand how to use it, and I haven't used it maybe in 6 months, but ACT doesn't really allow me to use GitHub Action secrets remotely, right? So then I have I end up with these really long commands that I'm never going to type. I have to copy and paste them or put them in a shell script or something. And it seems to make it really burdensome. And I'm interested in seeing how Dagger can maybe make all that easier. So we had Solomon Hikes on the show, and he's starting to convince me that Dagger's getting ready for prime time. It's got solving enough of the edge cases, and how do I use this across different CIs, and how do I not make it so that Everyone has to learn a new programming language. Yeah, it's going to be. I think it's going to be a tool that I might have in my toolbox, but I've got to figure that out. So I want to do that this year and then write about it and tell you about it. Raul's asking, can you suggest any projects on DevOps for freshers? Someone maybe has links, or someone can put something in chat. So I don't, how do I put this? I don't follow guides for learning DevOps. So here's the thing. You know, you're going to need to go and take certifications. If you're fresh into DevOps and you don't already have a job in DevOps, you're going to need certifications to make up for that lack of experience. So that's already so much work for you, right? So you're going to go and get an Amazon DevOps certificate, an Amazon. There's multiple basic low-level certifications across all major cloud platforms that you're going to need to get, because understanding a cloud, at least one of them, is a pretty expected skill. And then you're going to need to go get a Linux certification, because Linux is the world. I mean, yes, there is Windows and yes, there is Mac, but the world of servers on the internet are almost entirely Linux based. So you can work for companies that use Windows, and that's totally fine, but there's not as many of those. Running those in the cloud, running those with automation. So if you want to go where the jobs are at, you're going to need to learn Linux. And you're going to need to learn networking. And you're going to need to learn security. So you're going to need to get security certifications, Linux certifications, network certification, cloud certification. That's a lot of work. So I don't try to give people additional work by saying, go learn this project or go use these projects. Because once you've learned all those and you've got all those certifications, here's the trick. You're going to find what you're interested in. Maybe you're interested in cloud automation itself, just automating the cloud. Maybe you're interested in specific cloud tools like Terraform, maybe Ansible, maybe a cloud-specific automation tool. And you should learn those, and they have their own certifications. They have their own courses that you can take. But I don't really subscribe to the big, large DevOps courses that teach you a bunch of tooling. What I think you should be doing, if you're going to take any course, I have a list. Let's see. So at this link, I have some comments and thoughts. So I'll leave it at this. Go read that, Raul. And there's a bunch of theories that I have there and things that you should look into, things you should do. And then I mentioned one course. It's a LinkedIn course. And the reason that I recommend this course is because it spends a lot of time not focusing on tooling, but focusing on the important parts of DevOps, the humans, the processes, the culture. And that's the important part. You can learn a bunch of tools later. And when you go applying for jobs, and you should start looking at those jobs now, even if you're not ready to apply for a job, you should go look at what the tools they are asking for. So go look up DevOps jobs that have DevOps somewhere in the title or the description, and go look at what tools they want, because there are thousands of tools. You can't even know a fraction of those tools. So what you really need to figure out is what tools you're going to learn for the job you're trying to get. If you're trying to get a job with a company that runs on AWS, well, then you're going to need to go learn AWS. You can probably ignore learning the Azure cloud or the Google cloud, because if those companies are using AWS, you can focus on that. Nobody that's hiring you for an AWS job because they run AWS cloud is going to care about your Azure certificate. So you need to figure out what tools you want to be good at. And I can't tell you that, right? Because there's too many. So if I told you to go learn Jenkins, that's probably a bad idea, because even though it's extremely popular, it is declining in its usage as the #1 CI on the planet. So maybe I wouldn't recommend you go learn that right away. But you might find in your area the jobs you're looking for, the jobs that you're maybe going to be able to get because they're junior DevOps jobs, and you're going to look at those jobs and maybe they all say Jenkins. And you're going to realize, okay, I need to go learn Jenkins. And so you get a course on Udemy or watch some YouTube videos. You see what I'm saying? So there's really no one DevOps course I feel like that's going to prepare you for a job interview. And there's no real projects other than learning the tools themselves. If I sent you to a DevOps tool project that had you learning Ansible, but then the job that you were trying to get is telling you you have to know Terraform, well, then what good is that DevOps course I sent you to that teaches you Ansible? That's why something like this is important, because this kind of course teaches you all the soft skills that will not be tool specific. There's also a great book that you should absolutely read called the DevOps Handbook. I mentioned that in my GitHub Actions, or I'm sorry, in that GitHub post you just saw. I talk about different things you should look at. The DevOps Handbook just had an updated release, and it is a little dated, but they've updated a little bit. It now at least mentions Docker and Kubernetes. For those that have been working in the DevOps realm, it can be sometimes a good reminder. But the thing that I focus on, and the reason I always pick out this book for people, is you're not going to learn tooling in this book. You're going to learn the patterns and practices. That is way more important to your career than having to know a tool. Now, when you get to the job interview, they may, depending on the company, they may focus more on your experience with specific tools. And that's why I'm going to say, like, you got to know the tools for the job you're going to interview for. And there's so many tools. You might try to get a job in a company that is very leading edge, and they might be using something called Pulumi, and they expect you to have some experience or at least know what it is, or maybe even sit down and write some Pulumi in the interview. But if you went and learned Terraform or Ansible, you're going to be no good in that interview. So I think with DevOps, it's pretty hard to go expect to take one all-encompassing DevOps course or one DevOps walkthrough, which is going to be usually tool-focused, and get the kind of knowledge that you need to have that comes from books like this book or courses like the DevOps Foundation course. So anyway, that's enough of that. Good question, though. Am I planning on releasing any new courses on Udemy? Right now, I'm still updating existing courses, Alex, and we don't know. I don't know for this year. I want to release something new. I don't know if it will be on Udemy, and I don't know exactly what the topic is going to be yet. But keep coming back. As long as you're on my newsletter, Bret.news, you will know when I launch something new. Yeah. We don't know. Right now, we're focused on getting sponsors for all of this YouTube content and our podcast and our newsletter so that I can keep doing them, because I've been doing them for 5 years now and mostly for free. So we're looking for sponsors out there for sponsored content on this channel, and also for helping us get to conferences. So sponsoring us at conferences to do various activities at the conferences. So that's what we're focused on right now. Full disclosure, that's what I'm doing. I'm doing the business side of stuff, not the cool tech side that I wish I was doing. DJ is saying, really enjoying learning more about Docker from your podcast. Ideal for on the move. Recently learned about the Docker file syntax declaration. Thanks. You are very welcome, DJ. That was a fun little newsletter that I did, and then I did a podcast about it. So in case you're not on the newsletter, some of the more in-depth topics that I talk about in the newsletter, I call them monologues. I've started to put them in the podcast, and I sometimes just read the newsletter, but I feel I'm not that great at just reading a newsletter on making it interesting. So sometimes I just take the topics and I rant for an hour, and then we edit it down to like 20 minutes, 15 minutes. And recently we had one on Docker file front ends. It's a great segue. So if you go over to podcast.bretfisher.com, Docker files have versions. So if you go to this one, I basically talk about how Docker files have had versions for years now. Very few, if any, people I see are actually doing it correctly. And they're just lucky that their Docker file builds, because they might be adding something into their Docker file that requires a specific version of what's called the Docker file front end. And, maybe you're putting in a -- copy inside of your, -- chown inside of your copy commands in your Docker file. Or maybe you're using the ability to bring in SSH keys or mount a file system during your builds. Those are all modern features that won't necessarily work on old builders or non-build kit builders or other tools. So you have to be more careful nowadays. I explain all of that in this podcast, and where I think you should be looking for new features and which features I think are exciting. And I go through some of my favorites, and I explain basically why this exists and why you maybe haven't learned about it yet, or maybe you learned about it and forgot. But this is the secret line. You should basically be putting this line on every Docker file as the first line in that Docker file to ensure you're always getting all the latest features from build kit when you build your Docker images. And if you don't have that, you're basically leaving it up to chance. If you have an older version of Docker, it might not work. It might behave differently. There might be a bug. You don't know. So you got to put that in there. Thanks, DJ. Need an FAQ section. I remember this question from episode 199. I don't even remember episode 199. I don't remember any episodes. So Dan's got a great memory. I answer a lot of the same questions over and over. So, it happens. That's why we're here. For those that maybe aren't watching every single week. What is the ideal certification for developers with a short stint as DevOps? Zia, sorry if I mispronounced that. That is a question only you can answer, because it depends on the job. Look, there's 1,000 types of DevOps jobs out there. I've seen DevOps jobs that are really just managing build environments. I've seen DevOps jobs that are really ops jobs. They're managing production infrastructure all day long. That's just ops. That's not a DevOps job. And in fact, really, that's why the DevOps job is even a weird thing to say, because the term has been overused and taken over. It doesn't mean anything anymore. It means everything. It means if you even touch infrastructure or any sort of YAML file, you're now DevOps. But that was never the intention of the word. And so we're in this weird world where the word doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean. And so if you might have a title of DevOps engineer, so the certification that's going to matter is the one at your job that's going to get you that promotion, because they desperately need someone that knows that skill better. And this happened to me. I mean, back, even 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I was ensuring that my engineers couldn't get a promotion unless they proved they knew all the things they needed to know to be the senior engineer. So in that case, we weren't DevOps. This was pre-DevOps, so we were just sysadmins. And they needed to know very specific things. They needed to have a networking certification and a security certification. And then they needed, back then we were all learning web servers and stuff. So at that time, they needed like a virtualization certification, and they needed one or two other ones. And if they didn't have those, they couldn't become the top senior engineer title at the company. I needed some set of standards besides just you do great work to distinguish between junior and senior. And so one of the ways was you need to prove your expertise in the areas this job cares about. So in your job, again, you might be someone that works at Azure. You work with Azure, or you might work with Google Cloud. Going and getting an AWS certification at that job isn't going to impress them and isn't going to be useful. But if your company is all in on AWS, and you go and you get a couple of senior certifications to make yourself more rounded, there is a DevOps certification in several of the clouds. You can go get that, but your boss may not care about those. They may care that you don't have a security certification, because maybe they're a team, and I've seen this, they're a DevOps team, but they really care about security. So they might call themselves the DSO team, the DevSecOps team. And so they care more about security. So in that team, they're really going to care that you went out and got a professional security certification like SANS, S-A-N-S. It's a SANS organization. They're a nonprofit that teaches security on a range of topics. And their certifications are known for being challenging. And not everybody passes. So getting that certification in that company may mean a lot. It may mean a promotion or at least a pay increase. But other organizations that are maybe at the beginning of their DevOps journey, they won't even know what SANS is. They won't know what DevSecOps is. So you have to kind of position yourselves for the company you're in. And when you look at that company and the senior engineers or the jobs that you want, what certifications do those people have? What certifications are the resumes asking for or skills they're looking for? It's very specific because I've worked with dozens of teams over the last decade, and every single one of them, someone who's a DevOps person, they all do something different. Some of them are actually developers in developer teams, developing all day long, but one of their tasks is to make sure that Docker images are built and pushed to the image registry and that they have very few, if not zero, security vulnerabilities in them. So they are labeled as a DevOps engineer, or they're a part of the DevOps guild or DevOps association with a different team. But them going and getting a cloud cert isn't going to help them in that job. In that job, they're probably going to need something related to automation, related to Docker or Kubernetes, right? So it just kind of depends. And it depends on where you're weak. If you're someone who's already got a cloud certification or two, then a third cloud certification might not help you as much as a Linux certification. Proving that you know the OS can mean a lot to the right hiring manager. So anyway, hopefully I made my point there. I'm a little long on that, a little ranty. The roadmap for DevOps. Yeah, there's several roadmaps out there. If you go into our Discord server, these questions get answered over and over. So if you jump into Discord and just search for DevOps Roadmap, like roadmap.sh, this is one that's commonly referenced, right? DevOps Roadmap, which is this staggering and just daunting, ridiculous. This is insane. I mean, I was doing DevOps before we called it DevOps, and I can't do all this. I probably can't even do half of this. But I've maintained a career as a DevOps consultant. And that's because it's very hard to quantify what exactly makes up a DevOps engineer if we label every stinking job as a DevOps engineer. It's so frustrating. So I don't know how to help other than to say, go act as if you're going to apply for the jobs today. Find the job you really want to go after and you think it's achievable, and look at what they expect the perfect candidate to have and what you don't have. So then you know your gap. You know what you need to know for that job. That's the only thing I can tell you, because if we could sit here and go to job boards right now, I could pull out 3 different random jobs, and they're going to have a lot of different tools. They're going to have a lot of different expectations. Some of them are going to expect you to have certain certifications. Some aren't going to care at all about those certifications. So it's a tough question to say this is what everybody should do. But you can go over here. This is I put this in the chat, I think. No, maybe I didn't. So you can go check this out. But this is kind of, to me, what I would call just throwing, it's the kitchen sink approach. It's throwing everything at the wall and saying, this is every possible technology that you could learn. And the sad thing is, I don't even think anything in here is about the reasons behind all these tools. I've met a lot of people that use GitHub, but they don't use it correctly for DevOps. I've seen a lot of people that know how to edit YAML, but they don't understand infrastructure as code principles. They don't understand how to make all of their Docker images environment agnostic. And if you don't know what those things are, those aren't taught by tools. Those are things taught as policies and culture and the reasons why we have DevOps. So even if you click on this little beginner version and it gives you the simple one, the first thing it tells you to do is learn a programming language. No. So for some people, that might be an acceptable entry point. But I would honestly put that way down this list. If I'm hiring for most DevOps teams that I've worked with, I'm going to care a lot about this infrastructure stuff more than a programming language. In fact, I don't even think maybe 40%, maybe 50% of the DevOps professionals I met, again, their job has the word DevOps in the title somewhere. They're not full-time programmers. They might be able to read some code, but their job isn't to write code every day. And this is part of the problem, is that people that come from a developer background and they go into DevOps think that that's the only path to DevOps, is programmer, then DevOps. But I didn't come that way. I came through ops. I came through tech support. I learned how to fix printers before I learned how to code. And so I learned going up the sysadmin chain, and I learned scripting along the way. That was sort of a mandatory requirement if you're going to automate and manage hundreds of servers yourself. But I had to manage servers first. So I was ops and was always trying to help the developers get their code faster into servers, make the servers more reliable for the developers, help the developers onboard and give them a smooth process for getting their code into production. So my jobs were always titled DevOps, but I wasn't programming. I was scripting maybe, but I wouldn't call it full-on programming. So I didn't know Python. I certainly didn't know Go. Heck, I only learned Go in the last 5 years, but I've been doing DevOps work for well over a decade. So this all is very confusing, and it's just an opinion. I'd say, by and large, every DevOps job, though, could always use someone with more Linux skills. They're always looking for someone with more understanding of the Linux operating system and shells and how to use all the standard Linux tools, right? So that's a very common one. Every single person I meet who's going to have anything to do with DevOps needs to thoroughly understand TCP, TCP/IP, the IP protocol, all of the other protocols that come with IP, like TCP, UDP, ICMP, right? Higher level protocols like HTTP, right? There's all these different stuff that involves there, and a lot of people just gloss over that or skip it. But I find that you could never be a senior engineer in DevOps world, any job, unless you thoroughly understand Linux, networking, and I'm not even going to put other things like Docker or GitHub Actions or Nginx. Like these are all optional things. I would say that these two right here should be up front. And then that's for someone who's maybe not a programmer. But if you're a programmer, I've seen teams do DevOps automation in Ruby, which is not in this list. I've seen a lot of people use Node.js, which is not in this list. So again, opinions. It's all opinions. So my theory is if I had to go get a DevOps job now, I would go and look for a job that has the skills that I currently have. And if I couldn't find that job, I clearly need to learn some new skills. So I would start looking at those jobs and go, okay, a lot of these jobs expect AWS skills. So I'm going to go get certifications on AWS's platform. They've got tons of certifications. And I'd get the ones that I'm interested in and that the jobs are asking for. So anyway, that is that. All right, let's talk about something different. Here's what the road forward for here looks like for DevOps people in industry. Yeah, that's the thing. It's so confusing. You're thinking of getting, Rash is asking, I'm thinking of getting CKA certified this year. Any tips? And thanks for looking at my blog. Yeah, CKA for sure. Yeah, if you're wanting to be someone who manages Kubernetes all day, CKA is great. That's what that certification is meant for. I never got that cert because I've got over 30 certifications and I've been doing this so long. I just don't get the new certs. So I focus on the practicals and the actual usage of the tools, not so much what certifications teach. So I can't really specifically give you tips on CKA since I've not taken that exam, but there's a ton of stuff out there. I think nowadays my default, if I'm going to take a test nowadays, I just go to GitHub and I search for that acronym, and then it's going to list me a whole lot of repos that are probably, maybe they're example test questions, maybe it's a set of tasking, but all these certifications now have official guides. So what I tend to do is just kind of old-fashioned grunt work where I would look through their guide and they say, no this, no kube control edit and how to do that, or patch, kube control patch. And I realized, if somebody made me use a patch today, I probably couldn't use that without the help, without the docs. So then I would go and practice that over and over till I knew that command and all of its options. At least I'd use all the options once, and I could understand way more about that command, for example. That's specifically something on CKA. I know that command line options can be a challenge on the CKA. So I would just look at that official guide, and then if I get bored with that, like, I need to break, I need to do something else, maybe I would go and look up GitHub listing me example questions or projects that I can start that would maybe be a part of the CKA. But that's how I would kind of go old school. I wouldn't be looking for, one-stop shop, right? I wouldn't try to find one thing that's going to hand me all the answers for the thing. Because at the end of the day, I don't know about you, but at the end of the day, certifications, they matter for getting the job. But what they're supposed to prove is that you know how to do the work. You know how to use the tool. And that's what I really care about for me. I don't get excited about learning for tests. I get excited about learning something so that I can use it day to day. So what I try to do is just try to understand and learn the tool itself rather than worried about, do I know every little thing for the test? Now, I've taken over 30 certification tests and I've never failed one of them. And the reason I've never failed any of them isn't because I'm a great test taker. In fact, most of the time when I'm taking these tests, I always feel like I'm failing it. It's because I know and use the tools before I try to take the test. I know how to operate it. I know how to use it. I'm not trying to take the certification as a shortcut to getting a job in a tool I don't really know, right? So if I'm learning Kubernetes, that means I'm probably not only running it locally, but I'm probably learning how to deploy it in multiple different clouds. I'm learning the sort of nuances of how they're different there. I'm trying different distributions, and I certainly know and have used every single kube control command in the thing. And lastly, the last tip there is that you better be very comfortable with Kubernetes the hard way. I still think Kubernetes the hard way. I mean, everybody suggests it. Everybody I know says that you should check this out. But if you haven't done it in the last few years, you should definitely go back through Kelsey Hightower's Kubernetes the hard way. The reason that this is so important is I don't use these skills day to day. I don't need to manually create certificates for installing kubelet and having it properly mutually authenticate to the Kubernetes API, right? I don't need to change command line options in my systemd services that start up various Kubernetes components, right? I just don't need that stuff day to day. But this really lifts the curtain a little bit and lets you see behind the curtain of what exactly is going on when you install a Kubernetes distribution. 90% of us, almost all of us, are going to be using a Kubernetes distribution. We're not going to be installing Kubernetes by hand. That's why this is the hard way, is because it's by hand. So if you go through here and don't just do it and not understand what it's doing, if you don't understand certificates, it's time for you to learn how PKI works. And you're going to have to learn a little bit of that, because a lot of this is about certificates, about making sure that things are secure and that they can authenticate through public key encryption. Yeah, that's what I would do. So I go sort of old school, and I really try to know the tools as if I'm going to have to perform the job tomorrow. If I don't feel comfortable performing the job, I don't try to go take the test, because I don't try to cheat my way or shortcut. That's why I never did all of those like exam question cheat things. I think I maybe did one or two way back in the early 2000s, late 90s. But that was before we had Google. It was before we had all these resources on the internet. So the only thing I knew was way back then, you would buy the certification book officially from the official, like Microsoft or whoever. They would have like Microsoft Press. There'd be this book, and I'd study the book, and that's all I had. Like there was nothing else. So sometimes back then we would try to find, we wouldn't really find illegal stuff, but there was a couple companies, and I'm sure they still exist, but they would actually give you exam prep questions, and they were a little too close to the real questions, and so they'd get in trouble with Microsoft or Oracle or whoever, just like Cisco. So those were all the certifications I was taking back in the 90s, and so sometimes those companies would get in trouble because they were just too real of a test. And so I would practice the act of answering questions. I think that is a skill. You can find all sorts of exam questions out there. But the act of actually taking a test, thinking in the way these problems are described, I think that is a real skill, and I would always practice that back in the day before I took the real test. But I wouldn't use that as a shortcut to not knowing the tool, right? So, and I don't think I ever got 100 on a test. I don't give a crap. I'm never going to hire someone over someone else because they got a better score on a certification. Don't worry. Just pass or fail, right? Just pass. That's a great question, though. Certifications are another topic. Juan's back with, you really appreciate my production of my Udemy courses and my teaching style. Thank you. How much time do you spend researching, preparing the content, and recording? One of my problems is that I really have to know a tool before I can teach it. So I can't just fake it and teach something I don't really know. You'll see a lot of Udemy instructors. I'd say the vast majority of successful Udemy instructors teach stuff that they don't actually know super well. They maybe had some of the really big ones. They just have someone else make the content and they just read it. So I'm not that person, and I don't know how if I had to do that to live, I could probably make myself, but it's just not me, right? So I only teach the topics that I think I know well and that I feel comfortable. I would feel comfortable walking into a company and doing that job. So that's step one of my process. It's like when I had to learn Argo CD and GitOps and GitHub Actions, I had to go and do that in the real world for companies and have multiple, in my case, I'm a consultant, so multiple clients that I help them along that path. I learned a ton in doing it, and I worked in a team doing it. And then I realized, okay, I feel like I know enough of this. Let me go read more of the documentation, because there's always edge cases. Not all of us use every feature of every tool, right? So I didn't know certain things about Argo CD or GitOps or GitHub Actions. So when I made that course last year, I had to go and learn even more than what I was really doing in my day-to-day job. So that's, again, old school. It's not the fastest way. I don't really have any cheat codes for that. I just went and I practiced it. I tried different ways of using the tool. I obviously consumed lots of YouTube videos, blog posts, and then sort of brought together what I felt like was worthwhile knowing for most people, because you can't put everything about a tool in a course. Like even my 20-hour Docker and Kubernetes course, Docker Mastery, it's 21 hours of video, and I could easily make that 100 hours of video and still not teach everything. It's just there's no way to teach everything about Docker and Kubernetes in 20 hours of video. It's just impossible. I don't even think I could do 20 hours of Docker and get you everything about Docker. So the challenge there is, what do people need to know to get them to the next step? And if you're just learning, and most of my courses are 101s, right? They're beginner courses. So you don't need to know in a beginner course the most advanced Docker file. But I might throw something in at the end that does that. So I like to throw in a little bit of real world stuff. It's hard for me to not do that because that's how I do these tools. So I don't really have a special process there. I am definitely not great at amazing visuals all going around the screen and moving in PowerPoint. I'm not that person. I don't actually like watching those videos where it's just a bunch of graphics moving around the screen. And then I never see the person. I'm never seeing the real stuff. I'm just seeing generalities. and I'm always seeing like very basic stuff. That's just not me. So I think I hope that what my skill is I'm authentic, and I know these tools well enough to be comfortable to talk to you about them. Like you're not going to see me on here talking about Pulumi yet, because I haven't fully learned it past like the very basic 101 examples and just trying it a few times. I've never used Pulumi in a production setting. I would like to. I'd like to know that. Same with Crossplane. I'd like to be able to know Crossplane better and use it in production with real world infrastructure and real teams. And then I might feel comfortable teaching it if I do that. So that's a great question. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. And thanks for being here, Juan. What's the difference between DevOps, SRE, and platform engineer? Okay, this is going to be a short one because I've been talking a long time. DevOps is a job role that many people carry, and it can be many different things. SRE is more specific to an actual role in larger companies where it's more operations focused, but one of their main goals is trying to automate and improve the reliability of the systems in production. And that means they're probably going to be a programmer. They're probably going to work with the developers that are deploying code to make it easier for them to create production quality, high reliability software. And then they're probably going to be making their own tools to fully automate all the infrastructure. And the key there with the SRE is that they're not focused on writing the app for customers so much like a regular developer would be or a normal application developer. They're focused on writing code around improving the infrastructure, the reliability, the deployability, to be able to deploy software rapidly and it always works. And if it doesn't work, it rolls back automatically and it properly has all of the metrics and all the things that it needs. That's what I see SREs doing. Reducing toil. That's a big thing for SREs, reducing toil. Toil is whenever you have to do something over and over and over again and it becomes boring and monotonous. So you want to automate it, which means you got to create a tool or an automation or something. So that's one of the things they do. And then platform engineers it's not a new thing. It's just a new term that we've come up with that's basically focused on building tools for the developer. And it sounds very similar to SRE, but it's building tools so that the developers can do jobs without needing anyone else's help. That's how I see platform engineering. Platform engineering is me automating the ability for them to create preview environments or to create new environments in production without needing a DevOps engineer or an SRE to help or anything like that. They can just self-serve their way from first line of code all the way to production release, and that it's as easy a process as it can be, so that the app developer can focus just on writing the app. And they don't have to mess with infrastructure or build tools, CI automation, all those different things, right? So platform engineering is not new. We were building platforms for developers 20 years ago on virtual machines so that they could spin up virtual machines on their own, so that they could then jump in, test some code, and have a quicker release, and maybe even set up their own servers without ever talking to an ops engineer, right? Maybe at most it was sort of an approval process. We click a button to approve it. And that, we didn't call it platform engineering. We just called it making the dev's job easier so that the production operations people didn't have to get bugged every time a developer needed something. The key thing is platform engineering is starting to that term is being labeled as job roles or a team, a platform engineering team. SREs are often a team or a role, but all of those encompass DevOps. So DevOps as a principle is a part of all those job roles. You might have something called build engineer, which sometimes is also called DevOps engineer, which is annoying and confusing. But a build engineer is someone who's focused on, in large enterprises, just like Jenkins, the systems that automate building of the software and reducing the time it takes, ensuring the security tools are all there and working so that it's properly scanned and all that, and just streamlining that whole build process. In large teams, you need someone dedicated to that because there's so much infrastructure, there's so much to build. Well, that person also is involved with DevOps, but that's maybe not their title. Their title maybe is just build engineer. So I look at it, if you had to draw a diagram, this is all DevOps, and in it there's specific jobs. There's build engineer, ops engineer, SRE, platform engineer, these different titles that we've come up with, but they're all involved in the DevOps processes and culture, right? That's a good question. Toby's like, I don't even know if that's accurate. Now I call myself a DevOps engineer. I call myself a DevOps engineer to people because it's the quickest way to tell someone. It's not quite virtue signaling, but it's the quickest way to tell someone that you're focused on automation and working with multiple teams and trying to get code into production as fast as possible and as reliable as possible. Like, man, it's a weird world. I'm the one who doesn't agree that we shouldn't be calling ourselves DevOps engineers, but yet my title has probably got DevOps in it in all the places that I put a title out there. So to me, it just distinguishes me as different from the people that don't have anything to do with DevOps or don't even know what DevOps is. There's lots of software people that never touch or know what DevOps is or have to deal with it. So Bash is a programming language. Justin is here to advocate for Bash. Yay. Awesome. Hey, Srinath, sorry if I mispronounced that. Thank you so much for the super chat. Happy New Year. Thanks for your tip. My GitHub has much pride from scratch, apart from tech skills. Any tips to establish as DevSecOps professionals? Well, if you're already doing DevOps, you're just going to add a security component. So it's 2024. What you should be checking out are tools that we've had on the show before, like Chain Guard. Learn about Chain Guard. Learn about Docker Scout, which is a new set of tools from Docker around security. And learn about CVE scanners and make sure that every one of your image builds is being scanned and that you're dealing with vulnerabilities in images and you're aware about how to create smaller images with less vulnerabilities in them. So that if you're already in DevOps and you're working with containers, which you're here, so I'm assuming you do something with containers, that would be what I would focus on. I would focus on the gaps in my team. If you're already doing something in DevOps, look at your team. What are they not doing? Are they not scanning production servers? Are they not tracking what's in production? And are there vulnerabilities in production that I didn't know about because my images are outdated? There's now tooling in the this realm of DevOps that will help you with that. So yeah, I would focus a little bit on the tools, but go get a security certificate. Go just get a Security Plus or AWS security related certifications or Google Cloud security stuff. Just getting certifications in that case, if you're already doing the work, will help you. It's going to force you to learn certain tools to take the cert. The certs usually are not just principles, which are important. And that's one of the things I was going to say. Like one of the reasons you can get a cert is to force you down a road to learn certain principles, to read certain books, to take certain courses to help you for that certification. And so in that case, if you need the certificate to get a DevSecOps job, then you're probably going to focus on industry certificates. I don't know why I'm having a hard time saying that word today. You're going to focus on those. And like I mentioned earlier, SANS is an organization I've known for a long time, sans.org, right? And then, you look up things like Security Plus certification. It's been around for 30 years. CompTIA, that's a very generic one in the industry. It's basic. It's low level. It's not for advanced people, but if you can't pass that, then I would argue you probably don't understand the principles of security enough in infrastructure, in software in general, to really claim that you're someone who focuses on security. I always focused on security in my career as adjacent to what I was doing. I never had a security job, but I always felt that it was important. And I always wanted to try to be the person in my team that was the guy that knew security better than other people. So I would go and I took a certification on a firewall. I went and took a Cisco certification on routers, right? I wanted to understand all the different pieces of security, and a lot of security affects networking, access, RBAC, all those kinds of things. And I wanted to understand that really well. So I went and learned PKI and took a PKI certification for public key because I wanted to understand at the core of how that stuff works. What is a cert provider? What does a certificate server look like? How do I manage one? How do I issue certificates? What are intermediate certificates? How do I expire certificates and revoke certificates? I wanted to know all that stuff because that was something that a lot of my coworkers didn't know. They glossed over all the security stuff. So I wanted to be that person that the security team that I wasn't in, right? The security team would come to when they needed engineers to help them. And that's one of the things I love to do is work between teams and help other teams with my team, right? So I would always try to bridge between me and the developer team or me and the security or anything specific in the security realm. I would just dabble just a little bit so that they tend to sort of respect that. Other teams, when they see you learning a little bit about their job and you're showing interest in their job, they tend to like you more. They tend to want to work with you more because they realize you are respecting their craft and you're not just dismissing it as not important. Anyway, that's what I would do. Thanks, man. Thanks for the super chat. Will I add about Docker Scan DevSecOps section in Docker course? There are already tons of security stuff in the Docker Mastery course. What I don't teach is Docker, like Docker Scout is now the new way to do security in the Docker tooling, right? Docker Scan is being replaced with Docker Scout. So if I'm going to teach anything in the Docker Mastery class, I might teach Docker Scout. There is already some stuff in there about CVE scanners. You actually, in part of Docker Mastery, you actually learn how to go into GitHub Actions and add a security scanner called Trivy. So there's stuff in there. But I don't, since the Docker Scan underneath was just using Sneak. If you want to learn about Sneak, they have an open source scanner, not open source, but a free scanner that you can go use. You can learn that one. You can learn the Trivy one or learn Docker Scout. One of the things about my Docker Mastery course is I tried not to teach paid software because I wanted everything in there. If it's not going to be open source, I want it to at least be free. And the thing is that Scout really doesn't, it has some free features. So it's kind of weird because if I teach stuff that you have to pay for to even try or use, it's going to be a barrier for people in the course. So tell me what you think. I can teach the basics of Docker Scout, which is a good idea, and it's not in the course because they just released it 3 months ago. So yeah, Justin's saying, yeah, you can get the certifications to help establish credibility in your resume. And that's, yeah, absolutely. If you're new, if you're a fresher, then you got to get those certifications. Does the cloud you learn really matter? Yes, James, because if you get that job for a company that only uses AWS, they're not going to care if you got a Google Cloud cert. They will care maybe a little bit. Like it's better than nothing. But a lot of jobs, most cloud in the US, most companies are using AWS more than any of the other clouds. So if you don't know what job you're going after, that's why I feel like it's so important that you pick a job to go after. If you're going after a job and you don't have any idea what their tooling is, you're not going to know what certificates to get. There are definitely companies that are using AWS that I have worked with that if you had an Azure certification, you would maybe be in the running, but someone with a bunch of AWS certifications, assuming everything else is equal, they're going to get that job because that company cares about AWS. There are comparables between the clouds, but it is, in my opinion, the way you administrate them, the way you manage them for a real serious business in production is so different that I can't take someone from AWS and make them know all that stuff in Azure in a month. Like I can't do it because if they know RDS and EBS and EC2 and ALBs and ELBs, and they know all these things. They know security groups and all that stuff in AWS, and I sit them down in front of the Azure portal, they're going to be lost. I mean, I'm lost. I have accounts in all three, and I get lost regularly with the ones I don't use as often. So I would argue yes and no. Like, it's better than nothing, but when you start to get into the more esoteric services, if you're just talking about servers and networking and ports, okay, fine. Yeah, their buttons are different. Things are called something different, but you could probably get by. But the more you get into, there's technologies on Azure that you don't even get on AWS, like DynamoDB or whatever. Like there's lots of stuff that's just completely incompatible, doesn't exist, or between the two of them. And there might be some other thing that does something similar, but yeah, it's not. They're definitely not the same anymore. I got to vote for K9s to get things done. Yeah, I mean, I think someone who's only certificate ready, like Manvidar, I'm just answering your question, that I think if you're someone who's only learned enough to take the test, that's going to really get exposed in the interview. Like once you're in the interview and they, if they're not sure about you because you have a lack of experience, they're probably going to want to test you, and they're probably going to throw you some curveballs in the interview. And that's going to shine through if you really only know it well enough to take the certification. That's why I haven't seen this specifically, but I wouldn't be surprised if some hiring teams will ask you questions they know aren't on the certification because they want to see if you have real production experience, or if you're coming to a very junior, like DevOps junior, like trainee, almost like someone who's coming in as expecting to be taught a little bit, almost like an intern, then yeah, sure, fine. Just you have the certifications, you know that stuff, and you can probably get some internships pretty quickly with having just the certifications, because at least they'll know that yeah, you're not acting as if you're someone who's really done this, right? That's a good point. Does installing Minikube count? Toby, what does that count for? I don't even know what question that's for. You are most welcome, George. Thanks for thanking. Glad you're taking the courses. I need traffic running in EKS dev cluster. Any suggestions? Should I use Helm? Dan, I'm not sure how those questions are related. You mean Helm to install traffic? Yes. I mean, if you go to the traffic documentation, like most tools like that for Kubernetes, they will have a Helm chart, and you should probably use their Helm chart. I'm a fan of using Helm to install other people's tools. I'm not usually a fan of using Helm for deploying the apps my teams create, or I'm the internal apps that my company creates. I usually use Customize for those, and then I use Helm for anything external. If I need to run my own Postgres, mirrored cluster, replicated cluster on Kubernetes, I'm going to use an operator or a Helm chart to do that. I'm not going to use Customize usually. Nothing wrong with Customize, but usually the Helm charts give me the flexibility, and the industry tends to provide better Helm charts. At some point, Helm just kind of, for common infrastructure stuff, Helm sort of became the popular way to deploy that. So yes, I would do traffic. In EKS, though, if you're running an EKS, if I'm already running EKS, I'm going to try to see if I can't use AWS's provided tools rather than traffic. Because, traffic free has some missing features a little bit across hosts, and can be a little bit tricky if you're trying to use the free version of traffic across a cluster in a fault-tolerant way when you're doing things like Let's Encrypt, where you need to store the certificate in a central location like Cert Manager. And so with traffic, that can be a little tricky, and I would say that mostly I would use traffic in that situation. I'd probably either use the paid version as well as the traffic portal. They have a little dashboard you can use now. I think it's called Traffic Hub. Or I would use what AWS provided. Generally, when I'm in a cloud, I'm looking at the cloud's tool first for whatever that problem is, and I'm looking for reasons to not use it, but I'm defaulting to that choice. Because the reason I use a cloud is to save the time, not just for raw infrastructure. Like if we only cared about EC2 as the only thing we all needed and everything else was the tool we were going to run on top of EC2, then we wouldn't be using EKS. We'd be using Rancher or Mini or MicroK8s or whatever. So I'm always telling people, let's look at the tool that AWS or Azure or Google Cloud provides and see if that meets our needs, because it's probably going to be easier to manage in the long term. And I say long term because it might be easier to upgrade. They might even have automated upgrade features in Amazon or Azure. It just depends on which tool and which ecosystem you're talking about. So I don't know. I don't have any suggestions for running traffic in EKS because I've never done it. That's a good indicator, right? I've never seen a team do that. So they're either running, if they're running any third-party open source tools, they're running, and I can't remember what it's called in EKS. Someone's going to tell me in chat. The plugins or whatever the things are that you can automatically install with a one-click kind of thing in EKS. I forget what that's called, but I've seen DevOps guys monitoring the infrastructure most of the time. Is there any specific role that just monitors the prod systems? Yes, it's called ops. It's still a job. It still exists. And companies that take it seriously have ops roles. They might lump that a little bit into SRE, but if they don't have SRE titles, they're really just ops. I mean, that's the whole term of DevOps was we originally had just developers writing software and operators operating the software. I worked at several institutions in the 2000s, right? Late 2000s, right when the DevOps term was starting to get used, late 2000s. I think it was 2009. And the ops team operated, the devs teams developed, and there was a very hard line between them. When the developers were done making their software, they would hand it over to operations, and then they were done. And operations would figure out how to run it, figure out how to back it up, figure out how to make it highly available, and then they would monitor it, and they would do everything. And operations would often have either a sub-team or a separate team called the systems engineers or sysadmins that would install the infrastructure. And ops wouldn't necessarily install the servers, manage the operating system at a deep, deep level. They were really just focused on the monitoring and availability and keeping the lights on. And that's what I saw in a couple of large organizations, like hundreds of developers and engineers and stuff like that, or bigger. That's what I was seeing back then. So DevOps was sort of the culture of bringing those teams together so that they could work more cohesively. And that's why it was really originally a culture problem. It was trying to solve the problem of the fights that we would have essentially between the teams, because we were all, this team, the devs team over here, the dev team over here was trying to deploy updates as fast as possible. The ops team over here was trying to keep it as stable as possible. And those inherently conflict. And especially in the old days, before we had all this great automation, the more times you updated the software, the more likely you're going to break stuff, because the update was typically what broke stuff, not so much the day-to-day, unless it was a hardware failure or something. And so there was a natural tension, and the ops didn't want to update all the time. So then they would create windows. You can only update during these 4 hours on a Sunday night, and that's when we have the least number of people. And they would make all these rules to prevent potential outages all the time. And so we just all had to get better. So I'd say today, if you still have a dedicated monitoring role, it's some sort of ops. They may not be labeled ops, but that's what ops is. It's a great question. I got to drop. Justin, Happy New Year, everyone. All right. See you soon. You have to renew Security Plus. Okay. Yeah. See, most of the certifications now, they only last for so many years. And I don't know. I'm fine with that, I guess. They all got to make money. Yeah, okay, so we got some votes, I think, for Scout. Getting Scout in there. Yeah. You need to switch to an English nickname. Yeah, sorry. I can't read that. Sorry, George. I only know one language. Um, Sadly, I don't know Greek. I know some Greeks. I just don't know Greek. Um, yeah, I mean, you're talking about like someone's pulling the cables, setting up the network, computers and servers, managing the backups. That is extremely common, and that's the challenge here. Is I actually bought the domain called Solo DevOps because I felt like there was an opportunity for very small tech teams. I mean, companies that are, nowadays every company's got some tech people, right? Every company that's got more than 20 employees in it probably has some sort of full-time, even if they're just a generic tech support person. And locally in my area, there's a meetup that I occasionally go to a few times a year, but we have a meetup and it's really just it's an IT pro meetup. It's a sysadmin meetup. Most of those people don't do DevOps. So I come into the group, and these are the kind of people where they're the one person that manages the desktops, the servers, the networking, the cabling, the hardware, the software, the backups. They do it all, right? There might be two of them. Another company I actually worked with, it's a pretty big company. They have several developer teams, but they have an IT pro team that does all that stuff as well as the DevOpsy type stuff because they've only got like 10 developers, so they don't need anyone full-time DevOps or operations. So they just took the existing IT pros that don't know anything about DevOps and gave them yet another role. So now they've got to know servers and backups and hardware and networking and all that stuff and security and firewalls and routers. And they have to know all that. And then they have to know now Docker and Kubernetes and Linux. And it's just a lot. It's a lot, right? So I think some of the hardest jobs aren't working at Google as an SRE, where you're very, very focused and you're laser focused and you go deep down the technology stack and you know that one vertical well. I think some of the hardest jobs are the virtualists and the generalists, the ones that they're only one of two or the one of one tech people in the company that know anything about the servers or the cloud or the infrastructure because you're kind of alone. And so I actually wanted to figure out how to make a course. I never could figure out how to do it. And but I wanted to make a course called Solo DevOps that was only going to let you use tools. It was only going to teach you techniques and tools that one person could manage. And it wouldn't teach you things like, here is a method for sharing or managing SSH keys across 3,000 servers so that a whole team of people can quickly get into servers securely whenever they need to, right? That's a problem for a large team. It's not a problem when you're one person. So I wanted to focus on the problems that one person has, which is I've got too many tools. How do I do all this with less tools? Can I just do my job with Terraform and skip Ansible? Hopefully, maybe not, but just do Terraform, just do AWS, just use Docker, and maybe not even Kubernetes. Because if you're just one person, do you really need Kubernetes? Do you really need to manage Kubernetes clusters if you're the only person in the company that does anything with servers or cloud? You could probably use something like Google Cloud Run or Azure App Runner. I'm sorry, not Azure, but AWS's App Runner, which doesn't require you run Kubernetes. It uses containers. It has all those features, environment variables, has all that. Anyway, I never made the course. Okay. I think we're out of here. I'm about to lose my voice. Talked too much today for an hour and a half. Now I sound funny. You too can lose your voice if you talk nonstop for hours. All right. So next week, we're going to be back. I don't have a guest plan for next week, but we're still working on that. And between now and then, what you should do, if you're not already on the newsletter, get on the newsletter. So go to Bret.news. You can sign up for my newsletter. And my latest one has a list of topics. And jump in there. I'm going to give you all this list. So find me on Twitter. Find me in the Discord server right up there. Yeah, take a breath and have some water. Yeah, I did. Drank some water. But typically, somewhere around an hour and a half, 2 hours, I lose my voice if I don't drink my tea. I didn't drink my tea today. I have special tea. So I just need to sit quietly for some time, like an hour, and not talk. All right, so jump into the newsletter, see that list, and reply to me in the newsletter, or find me on Twitter, or find me on Discord. Let me know what you want. Let me know what topics I should be talking about this quarter and next quarter. And if you want to know more about AI tools, give me the tools you want me to look into, because I'll bring on those people. We'll find a way to get them on the show. What do you think? It's so emotional. Yeah. All right, man. People, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being on the show. And I will be here again next week. Nirmal's going to be back. He was actually out today. And my co-host Nirmal's going to be back. I'm excited about that. Another year with Nirmal as the co-host. He's a great guy. Works at AWS, if you didn't know that. So we're going to definitely have more AWS stuff on the show. We're going to have more Docker stuff on the show. Here on Thursdays, come back live. And then like and subscribe. Of course, like and subscribe everything I do. It's the only way that YouTube pays me any money, and they don't barely pay me any money to begin with. So I appreciate you, and I will see you next week here on YouTube. Ciao, everyone.